The Puncher. Written by Ron Mackenzie Lafergie. Narrated, written and narrated by Ron Mackenzie Lafergie. Yeah, there we go. This is the story of a man named Joe. Joe was a pretty normal guy. He lived in a home. He cleaned his home once a week, though sometimes he skipped a week if he didn't feel like it. He had a dog named Fritz. He walked Fritz once a day, though sometimes he did an extra walk, and sometimes Joe just let her in the backyard. He had a girlfriend named Becca. He took Becca on a date once a week, though sometimes they skipped a week, and sometimes they went on two. He also hung out with her most nights, though sometimes they would skip a night if they were tired. They'd been skipping a lot of nights lately, and Joe was worried. As it turns out, he was right to be. It was a Wednesday, hump day. There would be no humping for Joe today, and yet it would be the largest hump Joe had ever experienced. "It's over, Joe," said Becca, but she was so blasé about it, Joe didn't notice the seriousness of her words at first. "I'm sorry. It just feels like you take me for granted. You're checked out of the relationship, and it's like you refuse to fight for me. I'm sorry. I'm done." Joe tried to argue. He promised he'd change, offered gifts, prostrated himself before her, but it was to no avail. If anything, his blubbering pushed her further away. Joe cried. Becca left. Then Joe cried some more. Then, suddenly, Joe stopped crying. He knew what he had to do. She wanted a fighter. He'd become a fighter. Joe stood up, got dressed, then went to the basement, where his punching bag lay slumped against the wall. He walked past the bag and picked up 2 bright red boxing gloves. They were in great shape, barely scuffed, as Joe had only used the punching bag a handful of times. He gazed at them, feeling a sense of purpose rising within him. Slowly, he pushed his hands into the gloves and strapped them on tight. It was time. He climbed the stairs back to the main level and strode purposefully to the front door. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to open the door with his gloves on, so he had to take them off, open the door, and put them on again. He felt a bit silly, but that just further fueled his passion. He stepped outside to a new world. His world. No more Mr. Nice Guy. He was now the Puncher. "Well, hey, Joe," hollered Fred from next door. "Hey, Fred," replied Joe, walking up to him. He had never liked Fred. He mowed the grass early in the morning and often woke Joe up. Plus, he mowed twice a week and always made Joe's lawn look shabby by comparison. "Whoa, doing some boxing?" asked Fred, looking down at Joe's gloves. "Yep," said Joe. Then he punched Fred right in the face. Fred fell to the ground, hit his head, and was knocked out. It felt to Joe as if he'd absorbed all of Fred's energy as he felt himself start to vibrate with adrenaline and power. "Is that Joe I hear?" came a voice from inside. The door opened, and Fred's wife, Janice, came outside. "Joe, how are you?" When she saw her husband lying on the ground, her scream cut off the rest of her sentence. Then her scream was cut off when Joe punched her right in the face. That'll teach her not to make passive-aggressive comments about a man's lawn. "Mommy?" came a second voice from inside. Ben, their 5-year-old, opened the door and stumbled down the stairs before coming upon his unconscious parents and began crying. Ben was always crying. It annoyed the hell out of Joe. And lucky for the kid, Joe had already started down the street, so his face was spared. Joe continued to strut down the street, feeling powerful. Nobody would do him wrong anymore. Sure, people used to walk all over Joe, but nobody would tread on the Puncher. He continued to walk, head held high, eyes peeled for trouble. He breathed in the fresh fall air, and it smelled crisper than it ever had before. Joe felt alive. He turned a corner and saw a couple walking towards him, about 50 yards away. They were holding hands. They looked happy. For now. As they approached, they continued taking up the whole sidewalk, refusing to walk single file, which normally would have forced Joe to walk on the grass like the loser he is. Or, rather, was. With a tight jaw, Joe continued forward and walked right up to the couple. For an instant, they had startled looks on their faces, but a moment later, they had pained looks on their faces because they were punched in said faces. Joe didn't look back. He kept walking with a smirk. Joe wasn't sure where he was going, but his feet seemed to have a plan, so he went with it. Down one corner, then the next. A young guy was walking his dog. Joe watched as the dog took a pee on someone's lawn. Except it was on the main part of the lawn rather than the bit on the side of the sidewalk near the curb. The young guy must have known this was a faux pas, and if he didn't, he was about to learn. Joe hustled to catch up to the lad, who continued walking as if he'd done nothing wrong. But Joe knew better. "Hey, buddy!" called Joe. The guy turned around. He had a hard expression on his face and seemed ready to defend himself. However, a swift punch to the face, followed by a hard fall to the ground, indicated that he was not. His dog turned and started growling. Joe reached down to punch the dog in the face, but it dodged him and bit his arm. Joe pulled back and smiled as he rubbed his arm. The dog was too small to break the skin through his jacket, but the thought was there. He felt a kindred spirit in that mutt. They were alphas in this world of losers. He left the dog standing over his unconscious owner and continued his journey. Joe walked past a park and started to feel a bit tired, so he took a seat on the bench and watched the world go by. It was amazing how different things looked now that he wasn't afraid of people. He no longer feared their judgment, no longer bent over backwards to please them. There were two types of people: good people and people who were gonna get punched. At that moment, one member of the latter group showed up. Despite there being two other empty benches at the park, he decided to park his fat rump on the same one as Joe. To make matters worse, he leaned back and rested his arms on the backrest, forcing Joe to scooch over a bit. Then, as if desperate to rub salt in the wound, the man turned to Joe and had the audacity to drawl out, "Beautiful day, huh?" I mean, what was Joe to do? Not punch the schmuck? Teach him that he can go around sitting wherever he wants with no consequences? That's what the old Joe would have done, but not the puncher. He stood, clumsily straightened his shirt with his gloved hands, turned, and then punched the man right in his face. The man was angry, but when he saw the look in Joe's eye, his face fell, and he helplessly slumped away. He was right, thought Joe. It was a beautiful day. Joe continued his trek and passed by a grocery store. As he did, he noticed a mother arriving at her car. Her kid was sitting in the top of the cart. It was cute. She quickly unloaded the groceries, then lifted the kid out of the cart, gave it a kiss, then placed it in its car seat. Joe smiled. It was nice to see some good in the world. However, the woman then got into her car, leaving the cart next to her car. And Joe saw red. He turned and rushed into the parking lot just as she began reversing and stood in front of the car. Then he punched the car right in the face. That sure got her attention. "What are you doing?" she cried frantically. Her voice was muffled as she had closed her windows upon seeing Joe, but her fright caused her words to be loud enough to be heard. "You didn't push your cart away," said Joe. "So?" she asked. "That doesn't give you the right to hit my car." "Get out of the car," ordered Joe, moving to the driver's side door, preparing to punch her in her face. However, showing an unsurprising lack of class, the woman peeled out of the parking lot. Didn't she understand how dangerous that was with a child in the car? Joe shook his head, disgusted, and continued on his way, leaving the cart in the parking lot because it wasn't his cart and that's not his job. Next, he found himself walking to the library, which is where Becca worked. He wasn't sure if she was working that day, but he guessed his feet were curious, as that's where they led him. He gazed upon the statue of the lion in the front courtyard and thought back to his childhood, when he would stare at the beast and wish he could be so powerful. He realized, however, that while Joe would never know such primal strength, the puncher did. He was the lion, and he stalked off to seek more righteous prey. He entered the library, walking past a couple homeless men sitting outside. They asked him for change, and he declined, but he did not punch them in the face. They were to be pitied, not scorned. He went to the front desk, where an older man sat, scanning a number of returned books and placing them in the bin. They had met several times before while Joe was meeting Becca at work. "Hello, Sam. Is Becca working today?" Joe could hear the testosterone in his voice, and he liked it. Sam looked up from his work and gave a tight smile. "Joe, hello. I'm afraid she's not. And—" He seemed to be about to say something else, but cut himself off, closing his mouth. Then he looked down at Joe's boxing gloves and gave him a funny look. "What was that?" asked Joe, tension in his voice. He quite liked Sam and hoped he wouldn't have to punch him in his face. "Nothing," replied Sam. Then he quickly glanced behind Joe, then at Joe's gloves, before dropping his eyes again to his books. Joe turned around and saw a younger guy approaching. He was tall, several inches taller than Joe, and was very muscular. He had piercing blue eyes, dark hair, and a strong jaw. He had possibly the most beautiful face Joe had ever seen in a man, and he wanted to punch him in it. This must be why Becca had broken up with him. This pretty boy must have stolen her, and he would get his comeuppance. "Am I good to take this, Sammy?" asked Mr. Handsome, taking hold of the book bin. His voice was like butter. Joe hated him a bit more. "Yes, you're good," replied Sam, as he picked up the phone and started dialing, turning his attention away from Joe. Mr. Handsome started wheeling it away, then stopped and turned to Joe. "Hey, you're Becca's guy, right? Joey?" "It's Joe," replied Joe, murder in his voice. Not only had this guy stolen his girlfriend, but he was one of those people who added a Y to everyone's name. Joe hated those people. "You don't get to choose my name, or Sam's." Joe felt the camel's back snap as he walked up to the guy, wound up, and punched him in his face. It didn't knock him out, but the guy had the audacity not to fight back. He merely took the punch, then looked around with a confused expression. It was like he was too good to fight Joe. No, Joe thought, the guy was just scared. He realized fighting was hopeless, so he was scrambling for a way to save face. But it was too late. That face couldn't be saved, because it had already been punched. Joe smiled and strode out of the library, feeling lighter. He pointed out a nickel on the ground to one of the hobos, who just grunted and picked it up. Joe wasn't pleased with that rather ungrateful reaction, but he was in such high spirits, having taken down his rival, that he let it slide. A weaker man might have lashed out, but not Joe. Not the puncher. Joe continued his journey, legs leading him towards Becca's house. As he walked down the street, he heard the wail of a police siren. He stopped. Had they called the cops on him? Should he hide? Pfft, maybe old Joe would hide, but to the puncher, the police were merely potential punchees. He straightened and continued walking purposefully along as the sirens got closer. Soon he saw them driving towards him and prepared for a confrontation, but they didn't stop. They continued past him before turning into the library. Ha! Not this time, piggies. Joe continued his journey. It was the middle of the day, so the streets weren't too busy, and Joe only had to punch 7 more people over the next 10 minutes. Thanks to his high spirits, the sun felt even warmer, the crisp fall breeze felt even crisper. Life was good. Being dumped was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He should thank Becca for doing him a favor. As Joe turned off a main street onto the more residential area where Becca lived, he noticed a group of girls, probably 10ish, skipping down the sidewalk towards him. They looked so pure and innocent, but they were not paying attention to where they were going, and one of them stepped into a person's front garden as they passed by. Joe's fists clenched at the audacity. However, they crossed the street before he reached them and went into the corner store. Good. People were learning not to mess with him. Joe continued down the road for a few minutes before stopping and turning back. He realized he hadn't had a drink in a while and was feeling parched. So he doubled back and entered the store himself, just as the girls were leaving with slushies. They were talking too loudly, and Joe almost socked one of them, but they were long gone before he had a chance. It was probably for the best anyway. He didn't want to be that guy, you know? Joe walked to the back of the store and walked along the row of fridges to select a drink. He eventually decided on Gatorade. He'd need his electrolytes if he was going to continue his crusade. He awkwardly opened the fridge door, clumsily chose his flavor, Blue Blast, and brought the bottle to the front, where a line was forming. An old lady was at the front, searching through her purse for a coupon. Apparently, in all her years, she'd never gotten the memo that you should have your coupons ready before approaching the cash register. But Joe had a memo for her. And unfortunately for her, while the walker was moderately effective at helping her walk, it was not very effective at helping her avoid the punch to the face. The other people in line started yelling at Joe for what he'd done. However, one by one, they stopped yelling at him and started moaning in pain, because he punched him in the face. Then the store owner started yelling something about having called the police. Joe didn't care. That just meant more people to punch. In the meantime, Joe walked up to the store owner and, you guessed it, punched him in his face. He walked outside and saw that a crowd was forming, with the wail of approaching sirens in the distance. It would seem that his escapades had drawn some attention. Good. They'd get to see what a real man looked like. One guy walked up and asked, "Did you really punch an old lady in the face?" He said it all aggressive and had a disgusted look on his face. Joe didn't like that, so he wiped it off him with a punch. The crowd started screaming, but Joe raised his hands, and they stopped. Wow, he'd never felt so cool. "Okay, everyone," said Joe, newfound confidence building to a crescendo. "Form a line. I'm gonna punch every single one of you." They stared at him, awestruck, as he gave his powerful arms a shake to prepare for the onslaught. However, he suddenly felt strong hands grabbing him before finding himself pushed to the ground, hands behind his back. "I'm sorry, sir," said the cop as he handcuffed a struggling Joe. "There will be no punch line." The end.